So, good evening. Here we are. We are back from live on YouTube today in a different location. So we were in our cellar at the winery cellar, and today we decided to come to my parents' cellar, personal cellar, As yesterday we had my sister, today I asked my father if he could come and say just hello. So here he is. I take his name from him. He's also Oscar Quevedo. Podes vir aqui, pai?
Olá, Oscar Quevedo, brinde para vós. Saúde. Saúde.
So yesterday we were focusing on Tony ports, if you remember. What are Tony ports? Tony ports are those ports that are matured in oak barrels, like those that I have behind me and that my father has in his cellar. Today our focus is going to be the ruby style. Well, for those that are just arriving, today is the first tasting. Let me just briefly describe what happened yesterday. So together with your help, we were able to raise 3,500 pounds that we are going to split between two entities, NHS in England and Pesqueira Amiga in our local village. We also had my sister coming to say hello. The rest of the team is Fred, who is here in the taking care of your questions and suggestions. And we are doing this together with Vintage Wine and Port in the person of his owner, Tony Carter, and with the huge, fantastic help of the team behind Big Fortified Tasting, Alex Bridgman and Ben Reed. So thank you for these two institutions for helping us putting this together. Then we talked about the history of our family. Our family is a relatively young port bottler, but with a longer history on the production of grapes and on the production of port. We started making port back in 1889, and we start bottling it in 1991. Then we talked about the history of port wine in general, how port wine shows up. The 1650, when it started to have the merchants coming from the United Kingdom to Porto to take the port in barrel and ship it to England. 1756, the year of the demarcation, when the Douro starts being a region regulated and delimited. This is very important. This was the first wine region in the world to do something like this. So imagine for the Portuguese to do something that it was so innovative. It's fantastic, and it's still working amazingly after 200 and something years. And then we start tasting ports, 3 different ports, Reserve Tony, 10 years old, Collator, 2004, and we finished pretty much there. You shared with us a lot of questions. Fred was raising the questions, and so we are having an interaction that we hope we are going to maintain today. So sounds good, Fred?
We had a few pending questions and a few questions that arrived during the night, so maybe we should address them quickly before jumping to the head of the topic. So one of the questions is, are you going to do again this great advent calendar this year? Somebody wanted to make sure they can offer it to their friends. That was one of the questions. I think there was a question from Malcolm, if you can explain a little bit the Reserve White, but maybe we can talk about the special white port that you're doing and why it's so important for your company. Explain why organic viticulture is also very important and is going to take more and more place. And finally, are you going to declare a 2018 vintage port?
Wow, I think those are 4 questions. Let's see if I don't forget them. So before we get into our tasting, let's address yesterday's questions and overnight questions. Advent calendar. So about 4 years ago, we decided to make a port wine calendar. As a port producers, you couldn't do anything else. You couldn't do a whiskey or a gin. It had to be port. So we put together in a box 24 5 CL bottles of port, miniatures, of 12 different ports. So it does not include vintage port, because vintage port cannot be bottled in such a small size, but pretty much everything else. And it's a great way of learning more about port, the diversity of port, and having a great time, especially right before Christmas. That's the Advent calendar. The question about the white port. Well, there is a very well-known gentleman in the port business, Mr. Coburns. who gave name also to his family, gave name to a big and very successful port house. And Mr. Coburn's used to say that the first duty of port is to be red. So this shows a lot how the merchants were looking into the white port. They didn't want anything from it. They were not really interested in white port. Actually, there was a period of time when white grapes were not allowed to be planted in the Douro Valley, because the merchants were complaining that they were taking away the concentration that red port should have. People in the Douro didn't really want to obey, and white grapes were still there, were planted, and they were kind of mixed in the lagar in small quantities, maybe 1-2%, to soften especially the tawny ports and increase a little bit the acidity that we know that white port has more than reds. So the grapes were used, and port was being produced from white grapes. In many cases, a lot of families were making white port, but they were not able to sell that white port. We are included in those families that were not able to sell the white port. So my great-grandparents and my grandparents had some stock of white port. And we decided this year to release a 1970 white port. It cannot be named on the label 1970 because we did not register this port at the Port Wine Institute of the time. But it is from 1970. It's now 50 years old, and it's a beautiful port, a beautiful white port. We have another white port, which is that is a little bit old. It's not that old as the 50-year 1970, but it's a reserve white. That reserve white is 8 years old, and I know that some of you have already tasted it, Malcolm included. So it's also part of our portfolio. We have a small quantity of it, so we don't really market it that much because we don't have that much stock. And then on the more entry-level, younger ports, we have a dry that is great with a tonic water and served on ice cubes. Regular medium dry with about 90 grams of residual sugar, white port, and a lagrima. Lagrima is the sweeter version of white port, a bit more dense, higher in sugar. So for those that have a sweet teeth, it's interesting. And then we also important thing, vintage port 2018. It's time to talk about that. Yes, we are going to declare a small quantity of 5,000 bottles. This is already official. We got the approval from the Port Wine Institute a few days ago, but we were very confident that we were able to do that. 2018 was a harvest that started relatively early. It's one of those harvests that was still, which picking started in August. It comes after two other important vintage port years, 2016, 2017. But the quality of the juice, the quality of the port is very solid. So there was no reason not to declare a small quantity just because we had declared the two previous years. So this is what I think the more geek side of our group tonight wants to know, especially those on the port forum. So here is the news. Fred, anything else that we should?
I think we should.
Yeah. So you ready for the ports? Good. So we are going to start with a late bottle vintage port. Late bottle vintage 2013. It's the one that we have in our bottle. Let me put the bottle here. I found a spot. I don't know if this is going to fall or not. Probably not. Let's see if it's not. Late bottle vintage. So this is, we are getting already in the premium style of the rubies. Ruby port is that style that keeps more of the character of the harvest. It has a darker color. It has more of the fruity notes, fruits aromas like strawberry, some plums, blackberries. So it's definitely on the wild berry side. And Ruby port, contrarily to Tawny port, we avoid oxidation. We avoid oxidizing the port. So if we mature it in barrel, it's typically of a large size of a few thousand liters, and also for a short period of time. So this LBV was matured in a 14,000 liters Balseiro bin. You have seen those when I turned the camera yesterday. So as today we are in my cellars, in my father's cellars, it's not possible to show you that. But it's a big one, so the oxidation is very, very little, and we mature it for about 18 months, so not that much, not enough to oxidize, but enough time to get the tannins more soft and round and smooth. Ruby port has a higher concentration of tannins that come directly from the vineyards, because we use grapes that have higher concentration of tannins located in lower altitude close to the Douro River on the terraces, where the yields per vine are lower. And once at the winery, we like to extract more elements from the skin, more flavors, more tannins, and tannins together with acidity help, and a bit of the sweetness help port to mature for many, many decades. Port is among those wines that is better prepared to handle time. And LBV is not intended to age for several years. I mean, a couple of decades, it's steadily fine. Maybe they will peak before the end of the 20th year, but they handle well aging in bottle, and most of the time they improve during the first few years after being bottled.
Do you want to talk about the pairing?
Yeah. So, what did you prepare for in terms of pairings? Our suggestion: chocolate, especially on the darker side, with less sugar and more cacao. Fred, we have here two chocolates.
Yep.
One is 70% from Madagascar.
Yep.
And the other one has some nuts in it.
Yeah, so it's dark chocolate and grilled nuts.
Dark chocolate with grilled nuts. Nuts, it's a great food pairing for port. It goes great with Tawny port. It goes great also with a more matured vintage port. And we also have it here. I don't know if you can see it well. Well, some almonds. Let me see. Almonds and figs and some raisins as well. I hope you can see it well. If at any time you need us to show the food again, just let Fred know. And if you want the recipes of yesterday, we are going to post them on this thread, on this YouTube video. So maybe on Monday when we are back to the winery, but you'll get it again. So let me try the chocolate. I haven't tried it yet. It's very good. It's a great pairing. The chocolate has this bitterness, and bitterness is also what you get from the tannins of the ruby port of this late bottle vintage. So it works pretty well. If you have other food suggestions, let us know. Help the community, and let's spread what each one of us thinks that goes better with our ports this evening. One thing that, yeah.
Well, I was just wanting to point out that so far everybody likes it. Definitively, but everybody speaks about cherries, red currant, which I think is a signature of your vineyard, Val d'Agodinho.
If you turn the bottle, on the back label, you'll find the name of the vineyard where this port is coming from, Quinta Val d'Agodinho. If you are not familiar with geography of the Douro, it does not. The names I'm going to tell you don't help that much. But if you are a bit familiar, if you have heard of Ferradosa area, or even better, maybe Vargelas vineyard that is owned by Taylors, so it's next to it. This is a vineyard that my father, together with my mom, they planted 37 years ago in 1983, and it's a field blend. So don't ask me about the exact percentages of the varieties. I know that we have a lot of Touriga Franca, some Touriga Nacional, Tinta Roriz, Tinta Barroca, a lot of relatively high amount of Tinto Cão, among Morisco, among few others. This area always makes ports very elegant and complex. It's from this vineyard that we also get some of the grapes for our vintage port. We will get there now, as we are done with the late bottle vintage. So, the next port that we are going to try is the 2013 vintage port. And you may see that it has the sticker under the main label saying Quinta Val de Agudinho. So this is the vineyard where this port is coming from. Let me move the camera a little bit lower so you may be able to see it all on the screen. And I'll get a glass for me.
You want some? So there was 2 questions regarding VP. We can cover what is the process of declaring a vintage port? What makes a vintage being declared, approved? We can talk about that. And then Julian had that geek questions. How do we calculate the amount of vintage port produced in a year? Is it still in pipes, in dozens, or now it's liters?
So to the first question, maybe I should explain one detail about late bottle vintage, about the previous port that we just finished, this one. So the late bottle comes because this port, late bottle vintage, has to be bottled between the 4th and the 6th year after the harvest, while vintage port has to be bottled between the 2nd and the 3rd. So it means that the late bottle vintage is matured for a little bit longer. In our case, in the port beans that we have at the winery, in the bigger port beans, but also for several months in bottle prior to release them. That's why we call late bottled, because we bottle it later than the traditional vintage port. It has the same style, it fits in the same style, it does not have the concentration and the aging potential of vintage port, but it's a very solid, high quality ruby port. Vintage port represents less than 1% of the total production. Not for us, but for the whole, and also for us a little bit higher, but for the whole industry, vintage port is less than 1%. So you are now getting into the best of the best. We have 2 bottles of vintage port to taste this evening. This 2013 and the 2005. You will definitely see some evolution comparing the 13 to the 2005. Every single bottle of port, vintage port, late bottle vintage, the Collator, the 10 years old, the Reserve Tony that we tasted yesterday, everything has to be approved by the Port Wine Institute. It's the Port Wine Institute that certifies the quality, and then we are allowed to use this label, this certification seal that has a unique number in it, and that makes it port. For vintage port, the Port Wine Institute IVDP sets the highest demanding standards. So the concentration has to be very, very intense, dark color, a lot of flavors, a lot of things going on, everything on the primary side. So there should be no evolution, there should be no oxidation, a lot of tannins, a lot of body. So all elements that will allow vintage port to mature for a long period of time. Only then we get the port approved by the Port Wine Institute. So the level is very, very high. It needs to get 9 out of 10 in score. And you need a majority of the tasters to get it approved. It does not have to be unanimity, but it has to. You need, of course, a majority, over 50% of the tasters. Everything is blind taste, so they know what the producers submitted for approval, like Vintage Port 2013. They don't know who's the producer. So I think it's quite efficient and it works well in that sense. So Julian's question about what's the size that we use to define vintage port. Well, I think it's actually 12 bottle cases, so 9 liter cases. It's what defines the stock of vintage port brought to the market every year or produced in a certain year. Pipa, which is this size, is 550 liters. These are not exactly the same casks that we had yesterday at the winery that were behind me. This is a little bit smaller. Why are the casks bigger? One interesting reason. So the trade would set 550 liters for the standard measure, but for a question of transportation, as it's going to be done on boats, and the risk of a flip of the boat was quite high and happened every other then. So the buyer, the merchant that was buying the port, would not fill the cask to the top. So it would put the 550 liters, that would be about 85%, 90% of the size of the barrel, of the cask, but the other 10% would be air. So in case the boat flips, the casks would float, and you wouldn't lose your cargo. Smart people. Good. So 2013 vintage port. What do you think about that? Do you have any suggestions and any thoughts about this, Fred?
Well, so far people are saying it pairs very well with 70% Lynn chocolate. Again, more dark fruit to the fore with a nice spice on the finish, said our friend. And then I think what's important here is to notice that they are from the same year, from the same vineyard, and one has so much more potential, purity, and concentration than the other one. And that's how we decide to make vintage versus late bottle vintage.
Figs, very typical from the Douro. This is cool to compare 2013 late bottle vintage, 2013 vintage port. Late bottle vintage, more soft, easier, not as concentrated, not as dark, not as tense as the vintage port. Vintage port, typical from a Godinga vineyard, is this kind of mental, what's the name in English for that? For manjericão.
Oh, yeah, passion fruit.
No. Yeah, kind of passion fruit, but also pesto. How do you make the pesto from?
Basil.
Yeah, basil. I always find a bit of basil notes in this 2013 vintage port, and it's typical from this vineyard. That other years also happens. You need a relatively fresh year, because if the weather is warm or as it gets hotter, you lose this freshness. Pesto and passion fruit are relatively fresh, tropical flavors that will disappear once the temperatures get for many days above 40 degrees during August. If the temperatures go high, if you have a heat wave, like we had in 2003, for instance, you lose all that freshness, and raisins start to show up, and more of the plums, blackberries, yeah. Cool.
Some questions that. Also,
we have more questions. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
There was a question yesterday that I forgot, and somebody asked about it, so I think they connect. Why T-cork with a plastic and versus full-driven cork? Same thing for some of your vintage half bottle, and same thing for your Colleitas full bottles.
That's a very good question. Just before, yeah, that's a very good question. Then I'll talk about the other thing. Cork. Cork is probably, it is the best closure for a bottle of wine. I think there's no argument about that, as long as we are on a long-term perspective. We decided about 6 years ago with the 2014 vintage port, we decided to do something that I have never seen anyone in the world doing it, which was to bottle exactly the same port, a 2014 vintage port, under 4 different formats. One, which is a regular bottle with a long cork. Do you have a cork there, Fred? So a cork like this. The second bottle of this box had screw cap. Screw caps are getting more and more popular, especially for white wines and or wines that are going to be drunk in a short period of time. The third closure, and I will explain a bit about these closures right once I finish this. The third closure was a plastic closure. Has the shape and appearance of a natural cork, but it's actually plastic. It's also relatively popular because it is cork taint free. So we decided to try and see how it would work. And the fourth bottle was a shorter bottle, like a pot bottle. If I had a bottle here, I would show you, but in my father's cellar, I don't have, and I should have brought. My apologies. It's a smaller bottle that contains the exactly 750 centiliters. What happens is that I believe that the more close to each other the port is, the better it's going to age. If we have the same 750 liters in a very long, narrow tube, like with a very tiny diameter, I think we all agree that these 750 millimeters would not age as well as if they were in a regular bottle. So the more condensed, the more like a sphere form we have our bottle, the best it would age. And that was the goal when we made these four different formats. So going back to the three corks that we used, the natural cork, the screw cap, and the plastic. About 80% of cork is oxygen. That's why it's so flexible. You can easily compress, and after several hours, it slowly gets back to its original size. It means that some of this oxygen, with the time, is going to migrate to the exterior, but also to the wine. And it helps the wine to age, to mature. If we use a screw cap, we are blocking completely the oxygen exchange rate, or like the crossing of oxygen to the wine. So the wine gets very tight, very closed. And if you are opening that bottle in the first 2-3 years, that's fine. But if it's to age for a few decades, it's not the best. It's not the best closure for sure. Finally, the plastic cork. That's probably the worst of all the three closures that we use. Plastic, there's no taint, there's no bad smell that's going to come out of that plastic cork. The problem is that after a few years, that plastic cork loses flexibility, and it's going to allow the air from outside to go into the port. So if you are maturing your bottle of port in your garage, where you have your car parking going in and out, or if you have it or if you have mold in your garage, or if you have any bad flavors that circulate outside with a plastic cork, they may go into the port. So it's something that it's probably to avoid when you are looking into closures for port. So we made this experiment. We produced 500 boxes, and we decided to sell half of those, and the other half we are going to keep for us. And we sold several of those boxes to the United Kingdom. We want, more than anything, we want to empower you of this experience. You should have the possibility to see what changes when you change the closure. Instead of being me telling you, no, with the cork happens this, with the screw cap happens that, and no, it should be you to experience on your own side, in your own glasses, and to taste it. So that's what he did back in 2014. So to the question that we had about regular cork and T-cap, this cork is by far the best cork to seal a bottle of port. But this one is so practical. It's so easy to use. You easily remove it from the bottle and close it back. and you can put it aside for next day and open again and do it. Do it all the way, like until you finish the bottle. And if the port that we are using this bar top in, like the tea cork, it's to be drank within few years after bottling, so there's no reason to go for such a long and expensive cork. One thing, avoid laying down bottles with a bar top, with a tea cork. Really avoid. These corks are so easy to put into the bottle again that they are not prepared to close properly the liquid, the port. So avoid it.
Now you got a lot of people curious about those boxes of experiment, and they are asking if you're gonna release more. If it's still possible to buy, or
So this was a calendar that we release every year, and you will have the chance of buying it at the same website where you bought this fantastic 6 bottles of port, Vintage Wine and Port. We released it last year. I know that Tony ran out quickly of the calendars. They were very successful. We are trying to catch up a bit on the stock that we're going to have for this Christmas season. If you like to buy those, pay attention to Vintage Wine and Port website, or email, even better. You can email them now and mention that you would be interested in getting some, or maybe one calendar to give to your friend, or for yourself, or for your father, or for your daughter, whatever. The bottles are relatively small, but it's so they are easy to drink every day of the first 24 days of December. Any other questions, Fred?
That was a quick question. I think we answered it yesterday, but we can repeat. It's worth mentioning it. Why in some years you declare colleitas and in some years you declare vintage?
The difference between Collator and vintage port. So these are the only two, well, together with late bottle vintage, but these two ports are from a single vintage. The vintage port requires higher concentration grapes, higher concentration port, a high concentration standard, a lot of color, while the Collator, you want more of the elegance and port that is high, have a bit more of acidity, not necessarily coming down from the vineyards, those vineyards close to the Douro River. You need elegance, balance to make a Collator. You need more of concentration to make vintage port, and of course, balance is always necessary. But it's possible to produce both in the same year. 2004 is a good example of a year that it's not a vintage port year. There are some people, some colleagues of us that declared vintage port, but it was a fresh year, so we didn't have enough concentration to make it a big port, vintage port year, but it was fantastic for Tony ports. So 2004 is a good example of those years that you get freshness and work better for Tonys than for the Ruby style.
And before going to the last vintage, do you want to explain why you use regular traditional cork for your full bottles of Tonys? Do you believe that they can age in bottles, or there's no stress? Or
yeah, so going back to the tea corks and the full corks, we use this bar top in our entry-level range and in our 375s that are not vintage port. All the other 75s that are not on the entry level, we use a regular cork. 2 reasons. First, we do not know when you're going to drink it. And if you want to lay down the bottle, you're free to do it. It's not going to leak. Well, it may leak after a few decades, but it shouldn't. And you and me will be more relaxed. Every year we get emails from people, maybe 2, 3, 4 people that get one of these bottles that are closed with a bar top, complaining that they leaked in their cellar or in their floor. It happens. So there is no way of avoiding that. So we try to keep these very useful corks to the higher rotation and shorter life in the bottle ports. That's the thing. Shall we go to the last of the ports this evening, as we are getting close to the end of our 2-hour port wine tasting? Well, actually, this activity of the tasting of the 2005 vintage port started a couple of hours ago. I don't know if anyone seen on YouTube the video that we did decanting the bottle of 2005 vintage port. I have the decanter here with me. Here it is. This is it's a gift of a friend of Pedro Pardinhas, and we decanted this 2 hours, 2.5 hours ago. We gave it time to open up, to release a bit of those flavors that were more closed. We could, without any issue, rinse the original bottle of 2005 vintage port and put the port back into the bottle. So you could serve the port from the original bottle if you wanted. No problem at all with that. There was a bit of sediment in this port. Sediment also varies from bottle to bottle. So if some of you had no sediment, well, everyone should have a little bit of sediment. If some of you had a lot of sediment, is normal. Sediment increases with age as the color fades and it concentrates in the bottom of the glass. And I think we're ready. We're ready to taste this 2005 vintage port.
I am ready.
Fred, are you ready? Let's go. So one thing. Yesterday we were using the like small wine glasses, like this shape, white wine shape. Today we also brought the traditional port glasses. They are much smaller, as you can see. The top is more narrow, so the flavors get a bit more close there, especially the alcohol. It's not so exuberant once comes out. I mean, there's no rule here. Feel free to use one of the other. Something in between these two shapes, I think, work well. It's more of your personal preference. By the way, what's the temperature to serve vintage port? So I'm put the decanter back. Vintage port. We should treat vintage port as we treat regular red wine. Contrary to the tonics that have less tannins, vintage port has more tannins and more concentration. Tannins get very bitter and sharp when they are served at cold temperature. We can go as low as maybe 5 degrees, ideally 8, 9, 10 degrees for white wine, but we should not go that low for red wine. So my suggestion for vintage port is to serve at around 15 degrees. Ideally, drinking temperature is between 17 to 18 degrees. Serve it a little bit cooler, so it's going to warm up in the glass. Your house is probably not at 15 degrees, not even at 18 degrees, it's going to be at 20 degrees. The glass is going to be at 20, 21, 22 degrees. So the minute you put the port into the glass, it's going to warm up. So you need to count on maybe 2-3 degrees warming in the first maybe 5 minutes of serving. Swirl is something that helps the flavors to come out, and it helps you to get the aromas that you get into the wine, into the port. So swirl for a few seconds, and then once you have them in your mouth, avoid swallow immediately. You have different tasting buds located in different parts of your tongue. So the more that you are able to spread the wine, the port over your mouth, more experiences, more flavors you're going to feel, more things are going to happen. Maybe you are wondering how do we manage to keep sober when you have to work on a like 30, 40, 50 cask samples in the morning. We spit all the time. Spitting is a key part of our job. Otherwise, we would have a short life in this position. And even when you spit, you always get something into your stomach. So the limit is maybe 30 to 40 wines. After that, you get too tired and you can start to feel the alcohol. Today is different. Today is Friday, and we are only tasting 3 ports. So of course that we want to swallow. Get your bottle of 2004 Collator next to you because we want to compare it with a 2005 vintage port. Go grab it.
You want to talk about the food?
Food pairing. I'll go back to the port because I want to tell you a couple of things. So Fred's suggestion. We tried to keep local. Yesterday we went to the Manchego. I know it's our neighbor in Spain. Today we decided to keep as local as possible. So we have some. You can see better if I put it like this. You have some goat cheese, local goat cheese. Is it local?
It's local,
Yep.
and it's actually your mom's marmalada.
Oh, and my mom's marmalada. We have a few quince trees, and sometimes we lose the quince because they have to be harvested right after the harvest of the grapes, and we are so tired after making the wine and the harvest of the grapes that we lose our quince. But it looks like my mom is not being distracted by the grape harvests and still picking this quince marmalada with cheese. I think this is a classic. I mean, it never goes wrong with these two food going together. Let me try the cheese. Oh, and mom's marmalade as well.
So a couple of interesting questions. Are you feeling, well, I think it's a reality that port has changed. Vintage port has changed in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I think they are getting easier to drink when they're young, but how do you feel your company style has changed over the years?
So the evolution of vintage port throughout the last 50 years and how it had changed for our company. Well, in the past, the production of vintage port compared to the total production of port was much higher than it is nowadays. It means that we could say that the average quality of vintage port is probably not as high as it is nowadays. Nowadays, what changed is that we are making less port in lagar. I don't know if you know what a lagar is, but it's like a granite, or actually stone. It can be a schist, a stone square that goes as high as the size of your leg, where we put grapes and thread the grapes. We foot thread the grapes up to a little bit above your knee. So instead of putting the grapes being crushed and extracting the color with the use of an engine, we use human foot to crush the berries and to release the elements from the skin. Our bare foot is quite soft, so it's not going to break the seed, the pipe that we have in the berry, which is very bitter. Nowadays we have less lagars. Lagar have a disadvantage, in my opinion, which is oxidation. They are open, and you have a big mass of grapes in contact with oxygen. Until fermentation starts, there is no CO2 protection on the top of it. So your must is going to oxidize. It's like when you make a smoothie. If you leave the smoothie for several hours away, when you go back, you'll see that the color changes, and so you have to be very careful. It's true that we use sulfites as a way of protecting the must from oxidation, but lagars are less used now than they were used before. What we have now better is probably the hygiene conditions at the winery. So we have this balance of less production of vintage port in the last 2 decades, probably of a higher quality overall. Time will tell. We need decades to realize if that's true or not. In our case, we start bottling for for to sell with our own label. We have some of these bottles behind are from my father's production in the lagar. Maybe I'll get one or two and I can show you. But we only start making vintage port. The first one is this one, 2005. So we always had a drier style of vintage port, of port in general, with a bit more austere, with more tannins present. So it's kind of our house style. There are few other houses that also play on a lower level of residual sugar. Others prefer a bit sweeter. It's really up to you to pick those that you like the most. Let me see what I get from my father's wall. Well, maybe this one.
I think worth mentioning, Julian suggested that vintage port goes very well with pepper steak and aged steak.
Yeah, that's another great food suggestion. Is if you want to bring port to the table for the main dish, a steak is a fantastic experience. Use and abuse of the pepper, because the vintage port is going to be ready to soften your mouth when the pepper hits the tasting buds and gets really spicy. So, I mean, my family would keep some of the port that we were selling to the merchants in these bottles. We would label. I don't know if you can read it. So this is a 1975 Vinho Generoso Pesqueira. Yeah, so something like this.
Is it too geek to explain why it's called Vinho Generoso and not port?
Yeah, no, it's not. So this one is a 70. You can see here Casa Quevedo.
Well, actually, we only have 10 minutes, more or less.
Yeah. Okay. So we're getting towards the end, and any question that you have to answer right now?
So there's a couple of questions, and I think we should explain talk about a couple of things. First, do you have the feeling that somebody else in your family, either your generation or your lineage or Claudia's lineage, is going to be part of the future of the company?
Well, I think I've never said this in public, but maybe it's a good moment. I really hope that my children, I have 3 children, 5, 3, and 6 months old, so they are still very young. And I hope that they decided to get a job where they really can be a happy and fulfilled adults. My father never put any pressure on me to come back to help in the wine business, and that was probably the best thing that he could have done, and it made me come back 5 years after I started my career in banking with a huge motivation to help the family to do things better. And if my children are not ready to take over, they don't want to take over, it's totally fine. Maybe my sister's children will, and it's more important that someone motivated takes over the business than have just one of my child or the 3 of them just running the business because they are my children. I don't think that should happen. I think it should be the one that is more motivated, maybe the 1 or 2 or 3, hopefully not that many, otherwise it starts to be hard to manage between cousins and brothers and sisters and all that. But I think they should be free to decide. And if I would like any of my children to take it over, yes, but it's their decision, it's their call.
And then maybe more work for us. Claire gave us the suggestions that we should do a same evening, but only about white port. And there's quite a few people already saying they want to participate in such a thing. So
it's your fault, Tony. It's your fault, Alex. Before I forget, happy birthday, Penny!
Oh yeah, and before we forget, are we comparing the 04 and the 05?
Yeah, 04, 05. Thank you for helping to keep.
I think we're gonna need overtime.
Yeah, we need overtime.
Overtime.
Yeah. So, do you have your glasses ready? We don't have ours, but we'll get them soon.
So Put it in your father's glass. It should be here.
Yeah, can you do my favor?
Okay.
Can you pick more?
No, that's okay.
Where's my father's?
Maybe he left with it. It's too good to.
Fred, what is it? 2004.
It should be in the back.
So this is my 2005. "2004 from yesterday. I'm sure that some of you have an empty bottle. Those that don't can now drink the rest." So we are comparing, just to be clear and to make sure that no one is gonna get lost. We are comparing these two. Pam pam. Let's see if they won't fall. Okay. We have a fig hanging here. So what I see, and maybe we will agree on this. We don't have to agree. Actually, it's very boring if you all agree on everything. But I think it's in terms of visual things, like a visual approach, show us that Collator has a browner color, as it should be. If you recall well, the Tony Owl has light brown feathers, orange like brick color, and the vintage port has more of a reddish, like red color. It's not very dark, but it's getting actually a lighter, more elegant red, but it's still totally on the red side, not on the brown side. So there's no any sign of oxidation in the vintage port. It's a relatively young vintage port, so it shouldn't be. In the Collator 2004, we can feel a bit of this nuttiness, a bit of the caramel notes, a bit of the oxidation brought together with a bit of the smoke notes. You can feel a bit of the oakiness. While in the vintage port, we are more on the primary fruit. We are more on the strawberry notes. You may get a bit of evolution as well. I don't know if cacao is the best thing, but maybe figs or plums, dry plums.
Julian is asking, in a tasting, would you do tawnies first and then rubies, or how does it feel to taste tawnies again after the rubies?
Well, I have had both ways: rubies first and tawnies after, or tawnies first, rubies after. Actually, there are two rules. One, you should go from lower acidity to higher acidity, and you should go from less tannins to higher tannins. And you cannot fulfill both rules when you are deciding which you should go first. Tawny port has higher acidity but less tannins. So if you follow the criteria of the acidity, you should taste rubies first and finish with the tawnies. If you follow the criteria of the tannins, you should taste tawnies first and rubies after. Your call, Julian. Well, let's get to the last question, Fred. Keep typing.
Okay.
But
I think we should give an extra 5 minutes. I think there's a couple of things we need to talk about. Just like Chloe mentioned, are you guys offering visits? The answer is yes, but talk about the situation now that we're going to reopen. I want you to talk about organic. How is it important for your company? And the future projects that are coming that are super interesting for the people watching us.
Cool. So 3 things. Visits. Well, yes, but no. No, but later, yes. The COVID-19 changed our lives. It also changed what Fred has been doing at the winery. Now he's helping more on the bottling line and less touring people around. We do want to receive people. We do want to give you the chance of experiencing our ports directly from our cellar, or at least from our winery. Right now, we are not yet ready to take visits. I hope that soon we will start under some conditions, as everyone will understand. We are working on a procedures manual to make sure that everyone will be comfortable with the situation. We bought old warehouse, old lodge in Vila Nova de Gaia, so in Porto. that is ready to. It's not open because of the virus, but it will open in the next hopefully 2 or 3 months. And that's where you want to have you. If you are not able to spend few days in the Douro, at least you can visit and have contact with our ports in the city of Porto. It's our new investment. It could hardly be in a worse time. My father had told me that, but man, this is life. And early February, never thought that the COVID would be so big. Organic is something that the family is committed to. I think not because we only eat organic, not because we are like chasing for organic food anywhere, just because we believe that it's possible to grow grapes at an acceptable cost using no chemicals, or at least a very, very low amount of chemicals, and make it more sustainable for the nature and for our body. So we are not very conservative in this approach. We are more of committed to reduce our impact, and we started by 5 hectares. We have now getting close to 20. We start with red grapes. Grapes for vines for red grapes. We have also whites now. We have all our olive oil production under organic. So we hope to be able to expand more. It requires more labor, and we are a bit short of labor in Portugal. People don't want to live in the countryside, and they don't want to work in agriculture. It's a little bit like everywhere, no? Yeah, there was another question, Fred, that I think I forgot. No?
The organic, the future project, the new winery, the new vineyards.
Oh yeah,
maybe tasting experience,
the new
food and tasting experience that's coming.
Yeah, the new winery. Well, if you come to visit it in the next 12-18 months, you'll see that the structure is now too small to accommodate everything that we want to do, all our projects, and we are quite experimentalists. So we will soon increase the area of production, the area of stock where you stock port, the area for the bottling line, the area for the offices. I mean, we started being 2 people 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, and we are now 6 or 7 people in the office. So, and we are still the same structure. So we need to expand, and that's the thing that is now in the pipeline for the next maybe 12 to 18 months. White port. So maybe we'll be back with white port. I think we have a total of 5 or 6 white ports, so we can do something similar to this. Let's see if you find the right timing for that.
Big thanks to Julian for making the tasting mats.
Yeah. Julian Wiseman, the genius behind the port forum.
Asking if he has the software to make mats for a vintage port tasting.
I mean, it's endless, the discussions with Julian. I'm not going to get into that. If you want to know more about port, if you are really passionate about port, there is an amazing forum, the Port Forum. It's a UK-based forum. There's another one in the US of another friend, Roy Hirsch, for the love of port. The guys on the Port Forum are super passionate about port. They know a lot and humble. They will be happy to receive those that are newcomers. From our side, once again, for helping us to donate some money for the charities that need it. And I think this is it, no?
There's one quick note.
No? There's one more note. It's going to be the last note.
The voucher. Remind
Oh, yeah.
Voucher.
Yeah. So I hope that everyone has received the voucher. Take it when you come to visit us in Portugal. You can use it in our cellar in Gaia or in the winery in the Douro. Either one works. We have a small souvenir for you that you know that is on the voucher. If you want, drop me a line on social media or to my email. My email is oscar@quevedoportwine.com. And we will keep in touch. Let's finish this now, Fred. Do you have any last minute question?
Yeah, right. No, and I already said to the people, if they have any more questions, give my email address and we'll be happy to answer them all.
Thank you, Fred, for helping us. Thank you, everyone that is behind this. See you soon. Take care.